What would you have done? Several years ago, I led a synagogue trip to New York. Part of the program included a tour of the 9/11 memorial. Our guide around the site was a volunteer from the 9/11 Tribute Museum. We chose that particular organization because all of their guides have a personal connection with that nightmare day in 2001. Our group was led around by the wife of one of the firefighters. Her husband fell in the light of duty, and her testimony was heartbreaking. But if I'm honest, I was expecting that to be the case. What I had not anticipated was that the firefighter's wife had also been in the city that day. She was about to go to work in Midtown when she had seen the plumes of smoke from the burning towers. But unlike all of those who were trying to get away from the danger, this is what she said to us. "I looked up at the sky and I knew what I had to do. I'm a qualified nurse, you see," she said. "So I took off my shoes, snapped off the stiletto heels, and I ran in the opposite direction from everyone else, towards the trouble." Little did she know that her husband was in the inferno, trying to rescue people, or that by the time she arrived on the scene, he would be dead. It was not the tragic death of her husband which caused most of us to well up. It was the sheer heroism of this woman who had seen the danger, yet had run towards it, driven by her deep sense of duty. What would you have done had you been a qualified first respondent and been in Manhattan that terrible day? Which direction would you have run in? Today's Torah portion tells a story of a man who was called to follow his conscience by heading in the opposite direction. Lech lecha me'artzecha, mimoladetecha, umibeit avicha. Go from your country, from your birthplace, from your family home. Head in the opposite direction. Those words spoken by God to Abraham could have been said to each and every soldier and service person whose names we lovingly remember today. Go fight for king and country, away from your land, away from your birthplace, away from your family home. Like the off-duty nurse in New York, many of those men and women so bravely ran towards the danger. For others, in both wars, it was not an automatic decision, but go they went. They fought. They suffered. Many of them fell. Far too many. And their heroism, their sacrifice, is what we recall this Remembrance Shabbat with such profound admiration and with loving gratitude. Having lived my entire life in a country with no conscription and with no world wars, I have asked myself what I would have done at 18 or 28 or 38 had there been a call to arms and had there been a tyrant on the scale of Hitler whom this country had no choice but to defeat. It's an abstract question, but one that I think I know the answer to. Do you? What would you have done? What would you do? In Judaism, we are filled with a strong sense of duty. Duty towards our family, duty towards our community, duty towards those less fortunate than ourselves. There's also a clear duty towards our country and a duty towards our Maker. The Hebrew word for duty is not mitzvah, A mitzvah is a commandment. The modern Hebrew and post-biblical word for duty is chovah. It comes from Aramaic, and it means not only duty, but obligation, as well as to be bound by something. There's also a sense of indebtedness, and in some cases, chovah can mean to be a sacrifice. If ever there was a word that encapsulated the nuanced nature of soldiers going off to war, it might be chovah. Other Hebrew words that are connected with chovah include chiyuv, to not only be obligated, but to be liable or guilty for failing to fulfill a prescribed duty. Often in the usage of the word chiyuv, there is a sense of a life or death choice, usually around an action which is obligatory in order to preserve life. So what is our chovah, our duty? And what would you have done in 1914, in 1939, and even now here in 2022? This is the first Remembrance Shabbat when I'm wearing my great-grandfather David Meyer's World War I medals. It took me a while to decide to do it, but this year I felt I had to. Let me explain why. Back in March, I was at a dinner in Oxford, and standing with a small group of people whom I respect, Baroness Jan Royal, the principal of Somerville College, asked us what we would be doing right now if we were living in Ukraine. It was days after Putin's invasion, and we were seeing not only the mass exodus of refugees from the region, but also the heroic war of resistance led by President Zelensky. What would you be doing right now in Ukraine was not a question that I had been expected to have been asked. The immediate response from one person was that they would be in a factory making Molotov cocktails. I sat with the question for a little longer before replying that I imagined I would be a chaplain for the troops. And yet that night and the next day on the way back to London, I kept coming back to that question: what would you be doing? I asked myself if being a chaplain was enough. In a war of defense against an enemy hell-bent on eradicating my country, my homeland, my family, could I, at 42, have not taken up arms? Is that what Abraham would have done? The Abraham who, through an innate sense of duty, left everything behind. The Abraham who himself later went on to war. In Genesis chapter 14, we have an account of a tribal war. It's a familiar story of oppression by a coalition of stronger powers. Four foreign kings from the Mesopotamia region, Abraham's birthplace, attack 5 local kings of the Jordanian region, where Abraham now resides. The foreign king's goal is to conquer the 5 cities around the Dead Sea. After eliminating all those who might stand in their way, the invaders win a bloody battle in the valley of Siddim. Amongst the captives of war is Lot, the nephew of Abraham. On hearing the news that Lot, his nephew, has been captured, Abraham knows his duty. Without so much as a hesitation, he arms all of his servants and they set out for battle. Eventually, despite the overwhelming numbers of the foreign invaders, Abraham succeeds. And most notably, he refuses to keep a single spoil of war, returning them to the 5 local kings. And it is immediately after this episode that we get to this week's Torah reading, in which God promises to be Magen Avraham, the perpetual shield of Abraham. Like the nurse in New York, Abraham knew what he had to do. His sense of duty was clear. Likewise, the psychologist and author Viktor Frankl is clear in his account of his time in the camps during the Holocaust. And I quote, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, to choose life." End quote. That choice, that decision, to put duty first, to run towards danger, to fight for king, for country, for family, for freedom, that decision, that sacrifice, that chovah, is what we honor today, which is why in just a few minutes, when we bear witness to that heartbreaking roll of honor, listing the many sons and daughters of this community, those heroes and heroines who, for our tomorrow, gave their today. As you listen to that list, please try and focus on just one question. What would you have done? Yizkor, may God remember them.